Ambassador Olsen, we have our first draft outcome for the upcoming Ministerial Conference. What is it and what does it mean?
Well, I'm really happy to say that on 17th of February, we have the first draft ministerial outcome for the MC14 Ministerial Conference, which is focused on the Small Vulnerable Economies work program. And just to let you know that this was also the first outcome of MC13. So we're following a beautiful pattern here. And I think it sends an extremely strong signal that the WTO cares about the smallest and most vulnerable, and that we want to work together to make sure we have an outcome and solutions that work for small vulnerable economies. So hopefully there'll be more outcomes to come, but indeed, the first one so far has been from the Small Economies Work Program.
So it's a Small Vulnerable Economies outcome. What are small vulnerable economies? And why does the World Trade Organization need to take a special look at their needs?
I mean, that's both an easy and a difficult question. And I will say that the Small Economies Work Program has existed since Doha. Actually, this was a Doha decision. And the reason that it was so important is it was recognized that there's some countries who structurally have certain vulnerabilities that mean that they need special attention and special treatment. Now, the really interesting thing about the Small Economies mandate is that it does say we're not allowed to create a new category of countries. So as you know, in the WTO context, you have developed countries, you have developing countries, and you have least developed countries. Small Vulnerable Economies is not recognized as a formal grouping of countries, but it is recognized as important enough to have a specific work program in the Committee on Trade and Development. So in a way, it is almost self-designation, but there are certain criteria that had been developed many, many years ago, where if you met the majority of this criteria in its totality, you would be considered a small vulnerable economy, and hence you would be considered applicable for any special treatment. And this ranges from everything from climate vulnerability to high debt to GDP, to small population size, to small markets, to small and narrow supply chains, to a small basket of goods as well. Often you're very food insecure. And if you take all of these elements together, you do see that there's a persistent and structural vulnerability that demands that the global trading system treats you differently and responds to your specific priorities. So right now the group is made up of all of the Caribbean islands and coastal states, the Pacific island states as well, many of the small economies in the Indian Ocean like Mauritius, we have Cabo Verde as well, and we have some small Central and South American countries like Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. And that makes up the universe of these small vulnerable economies right now.
Could you maybe bring that to life for us, maybe with some examples from Barbados or from the region of a specific challenge or group of challenges that an economy like Barbados might have that a larger economy outside of this grouping may not share in the same way, and that might require some additional thinking or work through a work program like this one?
Sure. Let me see if I can give you a few examples so you understand how varied this is. First of all, let's talk about administrative burden. You know, in the WTO, you are expected to meet your notification requirements. This is a very important component of the whole transparency and predictability element of being a member of the multilateral trading system. However, with very, very small administrations back home, very limited capacity, we need assistance to be able to do these kinds of notifications. So there's actually a decision taken in the WTO General Council maybe 15 years ago that allows small economies to be able to use regional bodies to be able to do this kind of notification. Now, I know that may sound like a small thing for some countries, but for small countries that do not have the capacity, who do not have the resources to do these notifications, to do these testings, it's really important that we're able to rely on regional bodies, and that these regional bodies are considered valid and valuable elements of the whole notification procedure in the WTO. Now let's look at incentives, subsidies, which I know sometimes can seem like a bad word, but I will tell you that for small economies that are trying to build up their industries, that are trying to be part of different value chains, we do often need some degree of governmental support, at least at the beginning, to be able to support infant industries so that they can build the capacity and confidence to be able to contribute to building our trade profile. And many years ago, there was a decision taken that small vulnerable economies were able to use Article 27.4 subsidies, export subsidies that were traditionally banned, but there was an exemption for a time period given to small vulnerable economies. So that's a really, really important and very valuable example of how diverging from the rules, even temporarily, can help developing countries and small vulnerable economies like Barbados to be able to build up the kind of infant industries that we need. Then the third issue is around some of the rules that we're discussing right now. So for example, on fisheries subsidies, there was a part of that, of the agreement that was on the table around de minimis that would say that if you do not provide subsidies for overfishing, overcapacity over a certain level, you would be able to continue to provide assistance to your artisanal fishers, because fisheries is so incredibly important for livelihoods and for food security in many small developing countries like Barbados that are coastal economies. I mean, if you look at some of these small vulnerable economies in the Pacific, for example, 75% of their food source comes from the ocean. So they have got to have certain checks and balances to allow this industry to continue to be main providers of food security and livelihood security. So there are many different ways that I think looking at different elements of the rules, looking at certain kinds of concessions, even time-bound special differential treatment that can work for small economies and help us to be able to meet the requirements and help us to be really productive parts of this global trading system. Now, supply chains is something that we deal with every single day, but for small, vulnerable economies, our supply chains are usually very short, very narrow, and very uncertain. So take COVID, for example. During COVID, we were essentially cut off from receiving the kinds of medicines and the kinds of equipment that we needed to deal with COVID. So in a way, you have got to, one, help us to be able to build a productive capacity to be able to produce our own medicines, which we're doing right now, and also be able to help us to diversify into new supply chains where we can either be producers and providers of inputs, or we can be beneficiaries of these new and longer and, shall we say, a little bit more reliable supply chains.
So, having a ministerial decision, assuming ministers approve it at the Ministerial Conference, provides an ongoing mandate for delegates in Geneva to continue working on issues of relevance to small vulnerable economies. But the draft decision specifically lays out two areas of focus. Could you talk us through what those are and why they're important?
Well, I will say that the work that we do in the Committee on Trade and Development is really important. A lot of it is about experience sharing, knowledge sharing. A lot of it is about making sure that larger countries understand the particular constraints of small vulnerable economies. A lot of it is also looking at best practice and what could be applicable for different scenarios, what could be replicable as well. So even the discussions alone, the studies, the analysis that we do is really important for us to take back home to our capitals and be able to incorporate some of what we have learned, some of what we are sharing as well. Now, the focus of the ministerial decision is very much on trade facilitation and digital tools. And that for small vulnerable economies is really important because a lot of us have very limited natural resources and we rely on investment in our people. So services is a really important component that we need to lean into quite a bit more. But the whole digital sphere is something which I feel that we need to invest a little bit more in, understand what the opportunities are for small vulnerable economies to be able to upskill our people, to be able to be in the digital value chains right now, to be able to have ownership of the digital content that we are creating. So I think that this is an area that is going to be really important in helping us diversify our economies and also look for new opportunities for our people and for employment creation. And trade facilitation and logistics, that is so incredibly important because many of us are quite far from markets. I mean, look at the Pacific countries and you would see how far many of the Pacific countries are from their main markets in Australia and New Zealand and Asia. So it's also about having effective trade facilitation procedures, effective logistics providers as well, looking at documentation, ease of documentation to be able to ensure that goods can actually reach where we need it to reach. And then behind that is also looking at issues around standards. Because of course, as you know, standards is really the invisible component of making trade work. that small vulnerable economies also need to invest in. And many of us don't have the laboratories, we don't have the expertise. We're often standard takers and not standard makers. So a lot of the work that we're going to be doing in the Small Economies Work Program to give us the skills, the expertise, the exposure, the knowledge and technology transfer to be able to help us to adapt to this new world that we are existing in.
And then perhaps finally, before we let you go, you mentioned that this is the second time that the draft decision on SVEs has been really the first cab off the rank. It has been the first draft decision to be prepared for a Ministerial Conference. For those who don't know, that's really rare. It is in many ways the dream to be able to arrive at a Ministerial Conference with a decision that is agreed at the officials level and ready for ministers to consider for a final gavelling. Most are significantly less prepared than that. So I wonder if there's anything you can share from having been inside the process twice about what the secret sauce is here, or whether there's anything to learn more broadly from multilateral negotiations.
I would say three things. One, I would say building relationships and partnerships amongst the small vulnerable economies, but just as importantly with our colleagues, so that one, they understand what it is we're trying to do, they understand the rationale behind it, they understand that this is critically important for a small group of countries, but does not have any negative impact on others. So it really is about relationship building, and we have a fantastic set of delegates in the small vulnerable economies. And here I have got to do a small shout out to Libertad from Guatemala, who very much leads the expert work in the Small Economies Work Program, and has taken the lead in having outreach to other delegates and outreach within the small vulnerable economy community so that we can coalesce around our ideas and coalesce around language. So relationship building, critical. The second thing is you have also got to learn the art of compromise. You will never ever get 100% of what you want, and you've got to be very clear on what your first, second, and third tier priorities are, and be willing to give up something for ensuring that you have a decision that works for the majority. So the process was very, very challenging. There were many, many things that we would have probably wanted to see spelt out a little bit more clearly in the final decision. But you've got to take the temperature of the room. You've got to understand that we're dealing with very, very big challenges right now with multilateralism and being able to have agreements. And you have got to be able to be clear on where you can make concessions as well, and to try to meet everyone halfway, which is what I think we were able to do. And the third thing is, really, I would say our partner countries have been very understanding and have been willing to roll up their sleeves and work with us, sometimes very late at night, going back to Capital, sometimes to check 2 or 3 words. But this is the process of negotiation. The most important thing for me is that you're all facing the right direction, even if you're going at different velocities, and you all understand that this is something which will add to our discussions in the WTO, because in my mind, by ensuring that the most vulnerable have access to the capacity building that they need, the knowledge that they need, the platform to be able to express their views and their priorities, makes the whole system stronger.
Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Thank you.